Today, we're talking about why Israel. More than that, why Aliyah? I think it's important that we look into the New Testament, we look into the book of Romans. The Apostle Paul was called to the Gentiles. So his gospel is the gospel we really want to get. And within his gospel, he made it very key that it was to the Jew first. Why? 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 Let's try and see if we can get a few of those answers here today. Let's begin at Romans 11, verse 1. I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means. Paul wanted us to know right away that God did not reject his people. He didn't start with the Jews and then go, they messed up. I'm going to choose another people. Why don't we call the nations? No, he didn't do that. He goes on to say that what Israel earnestly was trying for, it didn't obtain, but the elect did. The others were hardened. And he goes on to tell us something very important. And as a Gentile, it's insightful. As it is written, verse 8, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes so they could not see, and ears so they could not hear to this day. He takes us back to Isaiah 6. The prophet Isaiah was given this great commission to be able to speak, and through speaking, he would actually remove the ability to see, remove the ability to hear, remove the ability to understand God's plan. And yet this is God's plan, because his gospel just wasn't for Jewish people. It was a gospel of love. It was a love story that would not only include Israel, but it would include all the nations. And Paul wanted the early church to understand this, and I believe his heart's cry is that this church today would understand it. In verse 11, he says, again I ask, as if he was re-emphasizing the point that God has not rejected his people. He says, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? And he goes again, not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles. One of the key verses in the Bible that tells you and me as Gentiles, those of us from the nations, those of us who call ourselves Christians today, why we're saved. He says, because they transgress God's laws, that salvation has come to the Gentiles. But not before he ends this verse does he give us a purpose in our salvation. And I think this is worthy for any one of us. He says, to make Israel envious, to make them jealous, some of our translations say. But yet in fully understanding these words, it's almost like to make them zealous, that there is a faith that God wants us to walk in by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, by the Spirit of God that was given to us after his ascension. That this outpouring of God's Spirit on the nations would ultimately bring us into a greater fullness. Why? So as to bring them into fullness. So that there would be a togetherness that would be in the same God of Israel, the same God who covenanted with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the same God who gave us Jesus Christ, and through his blood has allowed you and I to come into this family. Isn't this good news? In fact, he says in verse 12, but if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their fullness bring? Now listen carefully. He's saying that if Israel comes into greater fullness, there is greater riches for who? For you and me. For the Gentiles. For those in the nations. So he's saying you ought to know the importance. You ought to know the value of to the Jew first. In the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 16, I'm not ashamed of this gospel because it's the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. First for the Jew, then for the Gentile. Are you with me? He's saying here, let me read this again, verse 12 of Romans 11. But if their transgression means riches for the world, you don't have to be a believer. You know, I've got a cell phone, you've got a cell phone. This technology has only been possible because there's a people called Jews. In fact, you look at medical discoveries, many discoveries around the world, whatever field it might be in, and there is often a Jewish person behind it. God has used this small percentage of people on this planet so you and I could have a greater life in this world. It says, however, their loss means riches for the Gentiles. Yes. The fact that in the first century, besides a remnant, an early church that was all Jewish, it would ultimately be for a greater plan that all the nations could ultimately come to the saving grace of knowing Jesus Christ. This is good news. However, he does say, how much greater riches will their fullness bring? When Israel enters into their fullness, the fullness that God has planned for them, which includes not living in New York City, not living in Toronto, not living in Berlin or London, but living in the state of Israel. Coming to the land that was covenanted to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That in this fullness, in this restoration, as Paul says in Acts 3:21, the restoration of all things as spoken through the holy prophets, that in this restoration of all things, this is preparing the way for not only the Messiah to return, as we believe as Christians, but it also has everything to do with an outpouring of God's Spirit that we have not yet experienced. Do you want to come into greater fullness? Do you want the greater riches that is talked about in Romans 11 and 12? Well, we have to know that this is the apostolic gospel, a doctrine that Paul went to great lengths so that the nations would ultimately know, not only in the first century, but here in the 21st century. Verse 13 says, I'm talking to you Gentiles. Just in case you didn't know who he was directing his message to, he's saying, I'm talking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I make much of my ministry in the hope that I might somehow arouse my own people to jealousy, my own people to envy, my own people to zeal, and save some of them. How does the salvation of God's great plan come to Israel? It ultimately comes to a people that once were not his people. That's us, those of us in the nations. And through the blood of Jesus, we would awaken not only to know that we have an eternity, but we have a purpose while we still live on earth. Wow. And he goes on to say in verse 15, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Why, Israel? Because it's time to favor Zion. We live in this hour. I know. There was disciples going, is it now time to restore the kingdom? Is that what they said? Go to chapter 1 of Acts and you'll find it isn't. The disciples said, with a question, is it now time to restore the kingdom to Israel? It wasn't just about restoring the kingdom. It was about restoring the kingdom to Israel. The return of the Jewish people, the restoration of the land is just a part of our gospel. In fact, if your gospel of Jesus Christ is not connected to the land of Israel or the people of Israel, I'd suggest you consider getting a new gospel. And begin with the gospel that Paul was called to give to the Gentiles, to the nations. He says, for if the rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be? And he tells us, it will be like life from the dead. Wow. And so he goes on in the book of Romans to be able to help us as Gentiles understand that God has a plan for Israel, But that plan cannot come into its fullness until the Gentiles come into their fullness. And if the Gentiles come into their fullness, then Israel can come into their fullness. It needs both of us. In Romans 11, verse 25, he says, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brethren, so that you might not be conceited. He was basically saying that there's the possibility of a pride coming in, that you might not see this. Pride blinds us. It says, and this is the Apostle Paul, he says, Israel's experienced a hardening. What's a hardening? Remember he says a little bit earlier, they can't see, they can't hear, they can't fully understand. They only see and hear in part. There's a part for them to understand, just as there's a part for us to understand. It goes on to say, Israel's experienced a hardening in part until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Now I know and I understand that some of your translations say the full number. And for centuries there have been people that are teaching until the last Gentile gets saved, then God's going to do something with Israel. But first let's focus on the nations. That's not the apostles' doctrine. The Apostle Paul said to the Jew first, and that wasn't to shift and change at any time in history. It's still the same word today. He says Israel's experienced a hardening in part until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. The body of Christ needs to awaken to this truth. And we just so happen to be living in this hour where nations are going, oy vey, such a thing. Jesus is Jewish. It happened to me over 30 years ago. It changed my marriage. It changed our family. And it changed what I've done for life. I went from a businessman to bringing this gospel to you and helping us to understand God's heart for Israel, and then to mobilize us to go, well, what does this mean in practical terms? I've got the gospel, I understand. Well, Paul starts to talk about it in Romans 11. He goes on to say, as far as the gospel's concerned, they are enemies on your account, verse 28. But as far as election's concerned, they are loved on the account of the patriarchs, on account of the covenants that God made with Israel. For God's gifts and his call are irrevocable, just as you who are at one time disobedient to God have now received mercy as a result of their disobedience. And he goes on to say, so they too have now become disobedient in order, I love this word, in order. Remember, God does all things decently and in order that they too may receive the mercy as a result of God's mercy to you. How do they get the mercy? God has given us mercy to give back to them. Simple. We need to make room in our gospel to give God's mercy back to the Jewish people. Perhaps it's a way of saying thanks to God. I believe if we can be motivated out of a love for God, it becomes so much easier. We're not doing it out of legalism. We're doing it out of a love for God. And our faith is now from a place of obedience. We want to obey God's call to not only be saved by him, but in the course of our salvation to come to this place that he still loves his people. He wants to bring them into fullness, and he will use us to take the mercy he's given to us to give back to him. That's why we see in the beginning of chapter 12, verse 1, he's still talking about this mercy. Therefore, I urge you, brethren, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as dead sacrifices, as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Don't conform any longer to the ways of this world, but be transformed and have your minds being renewed. Are you looking for renewing of your mind? Are you looking for transformation? Is things a little bit dry in your walk with Jesus? It's absolutely connected to an intimacy with God where you will obey the apostolic doctrine of blessing Israel, loving Israel, bringing them to zeal, which means we're bringing them to fullness, By bringing them to fullness, God gives greater fullness to you, to your marriage, to your family, to your nation. He goes on to say that then what? When we take the mercy that he gave us and gives back to them, then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. His good, his pleasing, and his perfect will. Do you want your mind renewed so you'll know God's will? So that you're not only going to do his will in your lifetime, but you'll pray in accordance to his will in his lifetime, and it will be done? This is the key, is we connect with the gospel that is apostolic, that's connected to Jesus Christ and his blood that saved you, so that you can receive mercy from God and give back to these people, the Jewish people, that you might bless Israel, that you might comfort Israel, that you might help the Jewish people, that you would take the instructions that are written prophetically and find the scriptures that are for our time and our hour and be about the Father's business. God bless you.